Ready? Here we go. I was waiting for you. All right, so here's the thing. We're going to do something. It's a new thing. We're calling it Unedited. And what this is basically an unedited conversation where we just talk about something, right? And it's kind of like, this is like the pastor's episode, right? That's what this is. And I'm going to do this because we're going to put 20 minutes on the clock. 20 minutes, it started. Right. And we're going to be talking about church planning, the value of church planning. And here's the danger of unedited. If you say something that's just completely wrong, messed up, dumb, whatever, it stays in the conversation. It stays in. It stays in. Are you ready?
No.
Perfect. Let's do it.
Let's do it. If you don't know us, I'm Bubba. This is Dimitri. This is Drew. And we are pastors who are part of the Resurrection Church. And we're talking about church planning, right? So here's the question I want to ask. Why is church planning important? Is it important? And if so, why is it important? Drew, what would you say?
Well, as a church planter, I'll give my very biased, but I think still right answer of yes, it is important. Were we going to go around and say whether we think it's important? I don't know. It's important, first of all, because it's the most effective way to reach new people groups with the gospel. That was something that was really surprising to me when I first learned that. I always grew up in church, but usually, like growing up, my context for my understanding of church planting was like about church splits, because I had seen that happen. And so like a new church starting meant that a bad thing had happened, like in my kind of conception. And so for a long time, I wasn't really sure about church planting. Like I either thought it was an ego trip or like a church split.
Because whenever you had seen a church plan, it was because there had been some kind of fight.
It wasn't
or
a plant, it was a split.
And then they split.
Right.
And that was the only.
And then they called it a plant.
They called it a plant. That's not a church plant.
It's not. It's a church split. And it's not good.
It's not good.
So that was one of the things, learning that actually planting churches is the most effective way to reach unreached people with the gospel. That really started to change my whole conception and paradigm of like, oh, okay, then I need to be thinking about this in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's interesting that you brought that point up because I have a similar background in growing up in the Slavic community where that was actually kind of the MO. Like Slavic churches multiply through division. That was kind of the, very commonly known thing. Like, and it was always around very petty issues. And then when I became a Christian, I saw certain churches that were actually trying to pursue being faithful to the mission of God and reaching people and planting churches. It was just completely foreign to me. I was like, this is amazing. Wait a minute, you mean you're not planting because of some ulterior motive or some sketchy, like divisive issue? You mean you're just doing it because you want to send people to share the good news of Jesus? But honestly, like to me, that was like mind blowing to see churches actually do that or pursue those efforts in that. And so I would say that's 100%. I think it's an expression of saying we care about people who don't yet know who Jesus is, and we want to reach them.
Right.
The second thing I would say too is like it really does equip Christians to take their faith more intentionally and seriously and really begin to ask the questions like, what does it mean for me in my neighborhood, in my local community, in the city that I live in, to begin to live out, in a way that honors Jesus and to share the gospel. So that's part of what church planting does too, is it equips us to do that.
Right. So what's interesting is, so you both have planted churches, you're like in the very beginning, so you're kind of still
2 weeks in.
Yeah, you're still in the process, right? But you've both gone through a church planting residency, you've been equipped, you've been sent out, you've built a core group, you've planted, and you're in this process, and you're seeing firsthand like the beauty of it, the challenges of it. You're seeing God move in unique and interesting ways.
Yep.
When I think about like some of the, for me at least, what I think is exciting is when I think about like the early church, and you see in the book of Acts, and like people are going from like town to town, and they're preaching the gospel, and then people are hearing and they're coming to faith, and there's just a few believers in this city, and they're like, okay, you're a church now, and they're like, oh, what? Yeah, you're a church. And then they raise up leaders, and then they, whoever's preaching goes on to the next city, and they're now a church, and they got to figure out like, how do we be a community? How do we live? Like, how do we do this? Right? Yeah. You guys are living that out. You're experiencing that. Yeah. And so maybe let's talk for a minute about some things that you're seeing, right? Because we've said reaching people who don't yet know Jesus. The best way to do that is through new churches being planted. Right. But we've also talked about how a church plant can also be really catalytic in mobilizing and equipping believers to own their faith. Yeah. So what are some practical things you guys have seen?
Immediately, it's interesting that you brought up the early church example, because that really does emphasize a characteristic of church planting that unless you've really been part of one and are participating in church planting, you kind of wouldn't be able to see it. But when we were pursuing to plant a church, it's like Dimitri and people are going to go plant a church. And then once you start doing the church planting work, you realize how it's so not about you. Because you're like, we're the church planters. Nope. Not us planting this church. It's all of these people that God has brought and using together. And that's one of the most important lessons that I've learned thus far is like, wow, this really is something that God has to do and really bring up people and give them a sense of like passion and conviction and zeal, and saying like, we're going to participate in this church and be a local expression of the body of Christ here. And that's been challenging because you're like, how do I, like, I can't do it all. I've had to delegate. I've had to learn how to like if there's a need, I got to wait for somebody else to step in and fill it. But all of those different details of like recognizing that this is really a group effort that is wrought out by God Himself, equipping people to play their part and to come together, And so that was just an interesting thing that I was thinking about.
Yeah, I think a couple things that come to mind just for kind of our season that we're in. Like, we just launched like a soft launch 2 weeks ago, so we're still in very much the beginning phases of figuring out what it means to be that kind of community. Yeah. During this time, in this place, in Gig Harbor, where we're at. But one of the things that we're experiencing is like the grace of God through the constraints that He puts on us in that. Like, there's a lot of constraints, and like, you're the only one who like paid staff, and everyone else is volunteering and giving their time. And there's like a lot of like being pulled in different directions. Should we do this? Should we do that? Are we going to meet here? Are we going to do this ministry? Or, all these different things. But we've been just the last couple of weeks really experiencing just God's grace through those constraints. And really, like, I feel like, so the Lord has provided for us a place to meet, and we have 2.5 hours in this space. We have like this super tight window to set up, have a worship service, and tear down. And that could, on the one hand, be like, oh, this is crazy stressful. How are we ever going to do church in 2.5 hours? But really, I've come to see that as the grace of God, because we're not doing church in 2.5 hours. Right. We're doing one part of our life together during this time. And now look, we don't have to be obsessed about a building or gathering all in one certain location or whatever. Like, we come here to be sent out and be the church in the rest of life. Because if you think that we're going to only be the church when we meet together for a worship service, like, God is like almost taken that option off the table for us. Yeah. Like, He's totally disabused us of that notion of like, oh, this is church. Oh, this is one part of what it means to be part of the church and to participate. And now we get to figure out the rest of life and community together outside of this place in our homes. And so that's just been really cool to see the grace of God through what could be a stressful kind of thing. Yeah. But also, I think for Christians who are not part of a church planting should be encouraging and edifying too. We just had Ascending Sunday a few weeks ago, and I heard from a bunch of people how encouraged they were to be on mission by seeing what God was doing somewhere else through other people and realizing, I wonder if God is doing that same thing in my workplace and in my family and in my neighborhood and stuff. And so I think the more that we're talking about church planting and raising up planters and sending out, it shouldn't just be, look at what God is doing over there, but it's also calling our attention to what is God doing around us right here.
Yeah. You bring up such a good point, because a lot of times people will say things like, at the church, or like, hey, let's come and hang out at the church, or they'll talk about the church like the church is a place or an event.
Right.
And obviously we know that according to Scripture, though the church does come together and gather in, large settings, medium settings, small settings, lots of different settings, a gathering is not the church.
Yeah.
The church is the people.
Right.
We are the church.
Right.
And one of my hopes and prayers for Resurrection Church is that as we become more and more a multiplying church, we will just get that we are the church.
Right.
We're the church on mission across our region, and we sent out some of us who are the church to Federal Way, who are specifically focused on reaching that city. And we sent out some of us who are in Gig Harbor, specifically focused on reaching that city. And there's some of us who are in Tacoma who are specifically focused on reaching this city in this part of the region.
Yeah.
And obviously, we have people that are in different cities as well, right? And they are ministering to their city, their community, learning to actually be on mission with God every day of the week.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting because that's so good. And what we've been talking about right here is these two dynamics that have come up in our conversation so far of you have a heart when you're participating in church plant work, you have a heart for lost people, and yet you want to feel like you belong to a community that's doing that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like you don't know that you're with somebody doing the work if you don't know them. Right. So there's got to be that relational, familial connection that's happening, and at the same time, you're experiencing a heart and passion for the city that you live in, right? And the people that are in the city. And so this tension of like, we're now a local family here, and yet we also want to reach new people. And there's this tension there. That's a healthy tension, I think, and it helps people grow in their faith and mature with the church, and so forth.
Well, in a lot of times, it's like people sometimes, and I know I've done this before, where you think of mission, like mission is this obscure thing that happens over there.
Right.
But really, mission is just relationships.
It's relationships.
Yeah. It's just relationships, right?
Yeah.
It's like you have relationships with, people that, for example, you do a lot of meetings at the same restaurant. When I do a meeting, I'll go to the same restaurant. Why? Because I've gotten to know all the people there. Right. All the servers. I know them by name. They know me by name.
They know your order.
They know my order, right?
Yeah.
They know you guys because you guys come in there, right? And we've built relationships to where we're now a part of their community.
Right.
And we get to like one of the gals, she was a waitress there. She since moved to a different restaurant, but she came up to me and said, I wanted to let you know that I've taken a job at a different restaurant and I'm going to be relocating and this is my last day, but I just wanted to let you know. And I thought to myself, the fact that she actually even thought, I'd like to connect with you and let you know that I'm moving on to a different restaurant, to me said, wow, I think that we've now built the kind of relationship to where we're a part of this community.
Right.
That's mission.
Right. Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's mission.
Yeah.
It's just doing relationships with people.
Yeah. And to your point too, that I think one of the challenges for us as a church, Resurrection Church as a whole, has been that we want to have this regional influence in the Puget Sound region, and yet we want the local expression of that, right? To make impact in where we work, learn, live, and play. And one of the things about church planting is you begin to see that type of stuff take shape. Like the fact that I'm in close proximity with like 90% of the people that are in our congregation, I see them, not just on Sundays.
Right.
Like I see them at soccer practices.
Right.
I see them in the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
I see them, in gas stations, run into them. Like there's all these opportunities, in God's providence as he builds his church locally in those contexts, right? That are part of that relational dynamic.
Absolutely.
Which is cool.
So I'd like to hear this. Why don't you share a story about how not you, but someone who's a part of the church plant, how they started a relationship with someone and started to disciple someone, and just the impact that's made. Right? Because when we talk about church planting, it can sound like, well, this planter is going to go and this planter is going to do all this stuff. And we've already established, no, it's not a planter, it's a group of people.
Yeah.
But it's really not even about like the planter being the only one who's having those relationships. It's about everybody having those kinds of relationships.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. So maybe you guys could share a story of something you've seen that encouraged you.
Before we launched out back during the summer, we were doing our core group gatherings, and we just did kind of an exercise. I think it was our very first core group gathering, and we were kind of asking the question, why should we plant a church in Gig Harbor? And we had, I think, 26 or 28 adults at this gathering, kind of like info meeting, kind of vision casting. And I said, write down the name of every person who needs to hear the gospel that you like actually have a relationship with, like that who you could actually reasonably see yourself having this conversation where you don't have to like work up all the courage to bring something up out of the blue, like someone that you see all the time. And I think among the 26 adults there, we had something like 360 names in like 5 minutes.
Wow.
And it was just this moment of like, we already are positioned, like God has already been working before we ever even thought of planting this church to position this group of people to reach that group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just been, that's not one specific example, but kind of on a big picture, like, whoa, okay, we all have these people that we're already around. We don't have to go seeking out some like abstract idea of what mission is. Like you said, it's relationships. It's the people who are already around you. I just thought that was a cool illustration of that.
Yeah.
To go from 26 to 360.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what a cool exercise to be able to just say, who do I know? Like who's a part of my work circle, my friend circle, my extended family circle, my neighborhood circle. Like, if you have kids, my kids are involved in this activity. Who's a part of that circle? Right. And when you do that, you quickly see like you're already in a lot of relationships with a lot of people, and that's your mission field. Right? That's your mission field.
Yeah. Totally. And, for me, there's a number of different stories that come to mind just in this, in that aspect. But one of the stories was, recently we had one of our members, Dan Rawson, he shared a couple Sundays ago just about the significance of people recognizing that they may not know that they're making an impact on someone and someone's life that's a stranger to them or new to them, but they really are. And he used this example of his first time coming to church. And he came in, I remember this day. He walked in, he was super hesitant. He was super like, he was like, man, I thought I was like walking in and just completely not going to fit in and stuff. And just simple hospitality and just people willing to engage with one another and have conversations. And we had a couple that came up to him and just welcomed him and talked to him and, just invited him and brought him in to our gatherings, as his church. And later on, like Dan becomes a Christian, he gets baptized on Easter, and now he's sharing in retrospect his experience of people ministering to him. And he shared how important being like recognizing how many people have played a role in helping him see who Jesus is. Right. He talked about like his small group, life groups that he's in. He talked about the people that he met on Sunday that were just simple act of hospitality and kindness and just curious about his life and welcoming him. He talked about people who were intentionally talking to him outside of those gatherings about answering his questions, all this stuff. And he said, you guys don't understand this, but God in his providence is using you guys, even if you completely don't think about it that way and are completely unaware, by simply just having conversations with people and building relationship with people.
He just got baptized not that long ago, right?
Yeah, on Easter. Yeah. And that was super encouraging to me to know, like, yeah, God is doing stuff in the lives of people. And just because I don't see it personally doesn't mean it's not happening.
Yes.
You know, that's the temptation that I think a lot of Christians fall into, is like, oh, well, if I don't see something go down, you know. So, is that our time?
That's our time.
That's our time.
That's pretty good.
So there you go. 20 minutes talking about church planning.
Yeah.
Thank you for spending time with us. Hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.